Hello, welcome back to Storytime Sunday. Today we will be reading from the book Wilderness Outpost, turning to page number 107, starting there. With one eye on the calendar, Sheridan had been saving up his bacon for months before the arrival of the commission, awaiting the day when he could deal directly with Indians instead of losing a large share of profit by selling out earlier to the Hudson's Bay Company. In this manner, he raised most of the money he needed to carry him outside. He had, in fact, laid his plans so carefully that the very next morning after the day of trade, he rose with the sun and pushed his canoe out into the river to begin his long journey out to Winnipeg, where he was to meet and marry Julia Scott. Isaac, his younger brother, went with him. The two intending to accompany him to the crossing, but by the time the two had paddled upstream to Carcajou Point, about 100 miles, both were sick with a strange fever they could not understand. Isaac was the harder hit and quite weak, and since they were in the heart of the wilderness without aid of any sort near, Sheridan decided to put him in the canoe with a good supply of food and let him drift back to the fort where friends could care for him. He himself would hunt up an Indian camp, get a fresh canoe and new companion, and go ahead on the journey, trusting that the fever would break. To drift back down to Fort Vermilion would require no effort at all on Isaac's part, and his weakness would not be taxed further. But neither he nor Sheridan realized that they were in the clutches of a fever which could provoke both delirium and final unconsciousness. Yet that is the way it happened, and Isaac, unconscious at last from a fever he could not control, came at night to Fort Vermilion and floated on past his home without being seen. 40 miles further he drifted to the Vermilion Chutes, the only break in the navigable waters from there to Fort St. John back in the Rockies. He became half-conscious then, just long enough to comprehend his danger, and found himself in a canoe full of water beached precariously just a few yards above the plunge of the falls, the plunge that would have carried him to a quick death. He strained every pulse of his willpower to concentrate his mind to consciousness, and saw that his food was gone and the only salvage from the boat's whole store was one dry match. Delirious, he somehow staggered to shore, scraped together enough dry wood for a fire, and got it lighted with that one match. He sensed his position vaguely, and although he continued to lapse in and out of consciousness, managed for 6 days to keep the fire going until he was found, and by then he was a living skeleton, unable to speak his own name. At about the time Isaac had beached above the falls, 6 miles below, Tom Kerr, the sub-factor of Hudson's Bay Company's Red River Post, had wound up his accounts after the coming of the Indian Commission, got together his pack of furs, and started up the river to turn in his trade and reports to Mr. Wilson at the fort. Making the most of his meager authority, he climbed into his boat to loll at ease while old Louis Cardinal, Wampanu his son, and another Indian towed him slowly upstream. The first night the party camped at the head of the chutes, and saw at once across the river the smoke of Isaac's fire. Old Louis was confident it could not be an Indian fire, for he knew all the Indians would have pitched off by now for their summer hunting grounds. Tom was not interested and said that it was none of their business, whoever it was. His disgust was unlimited when old Louis and Wampanu piled into the canoe and insisted on paddling across. When the old Indian found Isaac and asked over and over if he were not Isaac Lawrence, the skeleton could only respond with a feeble movement of its jaws, making no sound above a mild murmur. At once the two loaded him into the canoe and took him back to share their camp and food. It was their tea, their bannock, and their bacon he ate, for Tom Kerr refused him everything, saying that the whole damned Lawrences could die for all he cared. So for 3 days and nights of slow travel through a cold drizzle, these Indians cared for the white man, sharing their food, holding him up when he stumbled, folding their blankets over him at night. He plodded along the bank with the Indians who strained at the tow line, while Tom Kerr, the scion of a noble Scotch family, rode in state in his canoe. To the last, the latter was harsh in his refusal to do one thing to help save the young man's life, even denying him the use of the boat tarpaulin during the rainy nights, although he had his own tent to sleep under. To hell with the Lawrences, let him die! By the time they had reached our house, Isaac had gained enough strength from the food and care of the Indians to be able to speak 1 or 2 words, but he was almost unrecognizable to us. Fred helped him to a bed upstairs, stumbling at his side, for he too had been suffering from the same strange sickness. Nor was he Isaac's only companion in illness. Within 3 days after the Indian Commission had passed, everyone in the settlement had come down sick with the same fever, with the sole exception of my cousin Florence and me. The old corollary was that we both were pregnant. We had to do double and triple duty in the days that followed, leading our horses to water, climbing up and down the riverbank several times a day to lug heavy pails of water for our pigs. Whole families were near death, not so much from the actual fever as from consequent starvation. No one was able to do more than crawl about for food, and many could not do that. In Uncle Henry's house, only Uncle Henry himself was able to get food. That was one reason we did not tell them immediately about Isaac's terrible experience or his present condition. The added shock might have proved too much for Aunt Maggie. A snippet from Wilderness Outposts, the Memoirs of Mary B. Lawrence from 1898 to 1907. See you next Sunday.